If the end goal is to create an environment that's close to nature as possible for our animals, then why are they living twice as long in captivity than actually in nature? Thought of the day. Well, not really thought of the day, thought of the week. Something I've been milling over in my mind, and I just kind of want to get it out there and see what happens. I mean, we're constantly on the progression. The whole reptile hobby is constantly on the progression, and we're always trying our hardest to strive for perfection, with perfection being their natural habitat. Creating an enclosure that's got absolutely everything in it on a humidity level, humidity cycles, lighting cycles, UV lighting, daylight lighting, visible lighting, the ambient humidity that comes off the plants that are in that enclosure, the humidity that gets stored within the substrate layers that slowly evaporates off through the substrate layers and through the air layers of the enclosure. I mean, absolutely everything we think on a microbiotic level, right down to the cleanup crew's feces correctly getting nourishment through the... It's a big, wide, mind-blowing thing. But why are we trying to strive for perfection, or why am I trying to strive for perfection, with perfection being the natural habitat of those specific species, when they don't live as long in that natural habitat compared to in captivity? Now, let's go through some of the downsides of having reptiles in captivity. This is probably just going to be a talking video. We can't provide stuff like the exact wavelengths of lighting that they would naturally see in the wild. They obviously have a need, a benefit, and a defense against all that natural everything in the wild. We can't give them that in a little box like this. Let's face it, if Diego the bearded dragon wants to get up to his lights, he can go up to his lights. If he wants to go out of his lights, he can go down into his shade. But does everybody produce that? Does everybody give them the option to do that in such a small enclosure? No, it's virtually impossible. It's the same with giving them dappled light. It's amazing how often they're observed in the wild hiding out in dappled light. So they'll go up onto their basking spot first thing in the morning, which is normally a branch that's right the way up in the sky, and they'll just perch on the top there. Now, they are very aware when they're up there of their surroundings, so they're constantly looking around, because you think on top of that log that's like coming up, it's on top of the log, they've got nowhere to run and hide, so they really have to be careful of predators, being the number one predator being a bird in the sky. So they're very alert and aware, and that's something they don't do in captivity. That's a natural behaviour that you don't often see. After that part, they've warmed up just a little bit, just enough to get everything flowing, get it all shaking in their body. They'll come down, they'll hide out in some dappled light. Now that's when the UV rays are getting just a little bit too much, or a little bit higher, because the sun's on its rise, or it's on its pinnacle sort of thing. They'll hide out in the dappled light. Have you got dappled light in your bearded dragon's enclosure? But then that's me assuming that they're hiding out from the UV light. It could just be something as simple as the infrared light, or the infrared heat is a bit too much for them. So that's why they go and hide out in the dappled light, because the dappled light will also narrow down the infrared light that they're actually receiving. It's a world of information that overthinkers like myself start thinking about. I noticed that with my leopard gecko. She constantly hides out in dappled light, and then she'll come out into the actual light just for 20 minutes a day sort of thing. Then have you got total shade areas, because it's often or not, they will either hide out in a burrow, they will hide out in a shadow, and they'll just hide away from the UV light through parts of the day. Do we give that? That's natural to them. Their mind is thinking of that throughout the day. We don't give them that in captivity, or the majority of the time we don't give that in captivity. So because we can't give, or we struggle to give, our animals their natural habitat, which is the idealistic version of perfection, are we bad reptile keepers? Because we can't give them what they can naturally get in the wild, does that make keeping reptiles bad? Are they suffering for our pleasure? Some reptiles, leopard geckos, ball pythons, don't actually have UV in their enclosure, which means they can't synthesize various vitamins and minerals and stuff. But then it goes even deeper than that as well. Like, the live food that we feed is not a natural live food to what, say, a bearded dragon would naturally eat in the wild. But then the live food won't be able to give that animal the nutrition it needs, or the nutrition it would naturally get in the wild. So in the wild, it could be living off chocolate, and we're trying to feed him a salad. That sort of things. But then it goes even deeper than that. These guys aren't going to be getting fed the nutrition that they would naturally get in the wild. And if they do get the nutrition that they would naturally get in the wild, that's not going to be the same nutrition that these guys or their bodies will learn how to absorb all of that nutrition. So we can't even care for them properly on a microbiotic nutritional level. I mean, we do have various things like the Reptile System's insect food, which is jam-packed full of superfoods that are going to benefit these guys. So are we trying to give these the best quality of life that they can get in captivity, or are we trying to give them a better quality of life than what they would naturally get in the wild habitat? If we're trying to strive for perfection, with perfection being the natural habitat, we're giving them food that isn't natural to them. It doesn't have the same vitamins and minerals built in within these animals to provide their natural diet to them, their natural diet on a microbiotic level again. Then are we doing good by these animals? Well, it turns out that if you're quite advanced within the hobby and you're really progressing through the UV stages, through the humidity stages, through the dietary stages, through the gut loading stages, absolutely everything like that, it would seem that we're doing better than what the natural habitat can actually do. Now granted, this is a big one, when that animal is in the natural habitat, he's 15 years old, he's older, he's slower. In captivity, we can sort of progress that slowly and keep him alive for another 10 years. In the wild, he'll get eaten by a predator. So we do have that in the wild. We don't have that in captivity. So that could be a key factor to it. It's just something I had milling around my head. And I just thought, I wonder if this is something else. I mean, you look at the likes of crested geckos. There's only a small plot of land on this globe where they actually reside. But they can't reside anywhere else. So we're trying to give them a better care in captivity than what they would naturally get in the wild, because one slight little natural disaster in that area, wiped them out completely, totally extinct. But there's more crested geckos in captivity than there actually is in the wild. I mean, that on its own is mind-blowing. Again, the natural disasters, they don't have them in captivity. Diego, the bearded dragon's not going to have sandstorms. He's not going to have wildfires. Nothing like that. We don't have to worry about deforestation in big tropical enclosures. We don't have to worry about habitats getting destroyed. All we have to worry about is the correct humidity, because we don't want no bad organisms within that humidity. So constant clean water to provide that humidity, a constant deep substrate that's going to retain the humidity and slowly let it off over time, just like would naturally happen in the wild. But again, naturally in the wild, you've got your dry spots underneath some of the big leaves and stuff like that. That's what would naturally happen in the wild, where they could hide out if they need to. Whereas in captivity, we use a lot of smaller leaves on our plants, so they can't really hide out. So maybe that's something to think about. Maybe that's the cure for something along the lines of tail rot within some of the tropical species. Provide a dry area for a tropical enclosure that's got the humidity, it's just not wet. So there's something else we can look into. Something we can't provide is natural disasters. Something we don't want to provide is natural disasters. A bearded dragon would get natural high humidity spikes in Australia. They'd have a big downpour just for 20 minutes. It would just flood everywhere, but that'll bump the humidity up. Now, does that rapid increase in humidity for a few hours help their respiratory system? Does it clear them out? Do they enjoy it? I would love to see some scientific studies on a bearded dragon's natural behaviour after a storm, after a forest fire, after all these natural disasters, so that we can then advance our care to a natural level to try and keep these alive for an awful lot longer, just like naturally happens right now. Bearded dragons can live to 25 years old, whereas in the wild, it's 8 to 15 years. It's such a wide gap. That's because you never know when one of them's going to get weak and get wiped out by a natural disaster or a predator. I don't think I've ever heard of a bearded dragon dying of natural causes in the wild. Is predatory attack a natural cause? It is happening in the natural habitat, same as a natural disaster. Same as if we look at bosque monitors and royal pythons, they come from a virtually similar location. One's more nocturnal, one's diurnal, but through the rainy season, they both show the exact same sort of scenarios. They move to slightly higher ground. They don't want to get flooded out. They don't want the burrows to get flooded out. They'll move to higher ground. Higher ground is cooler. They will start slowing down in that higher ground because it is cooler. That's again something we don't give them in captivity. But how does that benefit them in the wild? How does that benefit them in the wild? There's loads of unknowns, but the reptile hobby itself is still progression. I think personally, is the reptile keeping hobby bad? There are a couple of good things, really good things. One, we're keeping them alive for a lot longer in captivity, and we're keeping them happy, healthy. There's no threat, there's no worries, there's nothing for them in captivity. On the flip side, that can make them a boring lifestyle for them. So constantly having to give them feeding enrichment and a variety of varied diet, humidity levels, spikes and stuff like that, keep them on their toes, keep them going, but without giving them the threat. We don't want to scare them at all. We're keeping species alive because, like I say, if a crested gecko's natural habitat gets wiped out by whether deforestation, which is a high possibility, natural disasters, which is a high possibility, then that species is going to be totally extinct in the wild. Whereas in captivity, we can keep that species alive, learning more and more. The more times we can keep these species alive, and let's say that natural habitat does vanish, we can then breed for repopulation of that natural area. That's something I really highly love about where I live right now. We've got an endangered lizard, an endangered reptile in the UK called a sand lizard. I think there's only 4 places in the whole of the UK that have actually got these in the wild. One of those locations is right by me, and there's some really big organisations like Chester Zoo, Conservation Acts, that captive breed for wild repopulation. So that's something that you can do in captivity that nature can't provide. Nature is such a wonderful thing. You look at the mourning geckos there, they have evolved to not need a male. That's why they're called mourning geckos, because they're forever mourning a male. They've got parthenogenesis. They can reproduce fertile eggs without the need of a male, repopulating their natural habitat. Could crested geckos do that in the wild if their habitat gets destroyed? I'm just using these as examples, but is the reptile hobby good? Is it good for our animals? Is it good for us? Yes, I think so, especially with the way it's going. The reptile hobby isn't as far advanced as the aquarium hobby yet, but we're definitely getting there. With the various different gut loads, with all the information to do with UV lighting and infrared lighting, with all the people pushing for use as large a closure as you can physically get away with. The amount of people that say the small ones are better because they feel more comfortable, they get stressed out in larger enclosures. I mean, you look at that, that's a massive enclosure for the animal that's going in there. I want to get bigger enclosures for them. I've got a huge enclosure for my savannah monitor, a huge enclosure for my my boa constrictor. I've got a 4-foot enclosure for a leopard gecko with so much enrichment built in within that. And the reptile hobby is a constant learning career. It's a constant progression. I can't wait to see where the reptile hobby is at in 10 years. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. If you're new around here, please subscribe.